On the specification for memory, there's a section on forgetting, and there are two explanations for forgetting. The first is interference theory, which is what we're going to look at now, and the second is called retrieval failure, and there's another video on that one. When we talk about forgetting, then we're talking about forgetting in long-term memory only. And if you remember about the capacity of long-term memory, then it's meant to be, well, potentially your memory could be forever. And when we talk about forgetting, what we're saying is that the memory is still there, but we just can't access the memory. So some forgetting takes place because of interference. And if you think about the word interference, if something is interfering, it is getting in the way, isn't it? And so when we talk about memory, we're talking about that something is blocking, something's getting in the way, it's interfering with your long-term memory, which means that temporarily you can't recall it. I always think about like a TV. If there's interference on the TV goes all fuzzy, doesn't it? So you can't see the picture. And our memories are like that. If something is interfering with your memory, it's going to distort the picture of the memory. It's going to distort or block the memory, so you can't access it until the interference goes away. So interference means that one memory is blocking or distorting another memory, and that means that you can't recall it at the moment. And that's just the key term there, forgetting, because one memory blocks another, causing one or both memories to be distorted or forgotten. So there's two types of interference named on the spec. One is proactive interference and the other is retroactive. Proactive interference means an older memory interferes with a newer one. So something that occurred in the past is interfering with your memory for something newer. And retroactive interference is similar. Well, it's the opposite. It's not similar. It's the opposite. Retroactive interference occurs when a new memory interferes with an older one. So something that's occurred in the near past is interfering with your memory for something that happened in the more distant past. And I've put some Harry Potter books here for an example. I read these a long time ago and there was lots of them. But if you've never watched or read Harry Potter, then just think of any box set that you've read or watched where there's a lot of them. So proactive interference just means that something in an earlier book or film of Harry Potter or whatever is interfering with your memory about something that occurs in the later books or films. And retroactive interference, something that occurred in a later book or film, is interfering with your memory about something that occurred in an earlier one. So there's two examples here that I want you to identify which is which. One is proactive and one is retroactive interference. So we've got Alexandra. Alexandra changed her surname to her husband's name when they got married. She went from being Alexandra Burns to Alexandra Wyatt. She teaches reception class in a primary school, and the children keep calling her Miss Burns instead of Miss Wyatt. So they can't remember to call her Mrs. Wyatt. They can only remember her previous surname. A year later, Alexandra's friend told her that she can't remember her maiden name, which is her name before she got married. Even when her friend thinks really hard, she can only remember the surname Wyatt. So if you pause the video and identify which is proactive and which is retroactive. So hopefully you've identified the first one is proactive because the children, they keep calling her Miss Burns. So that earlier memory, the first memory of her name, Miss Burns, is interfering with the later memory of Mrs. Wyatt. So they keep calling her Miss Burns. So that's proactive. And then the second one obviously is retroactive. So her friend has come to know her now as Mrs. Wyatt, that's the surname. And even when she thinks really hard, Wyatt, the name Wyatt, is blocking the memory of her maiden name, which was Miss Burns. So she can't recall the maiden name. So that's retroactive interference. The newer memory of Wyatt is interfering with the older one of Burns. The last thing about proactive interference is that it can involve stereotypes and prejudices, that those can distort our memories. So when we're talking about proactive interference, we're talking about older memories. We're talking about things that are already there, that are blocking and distorting newer memories. So a task to kind of identify this is, I want you to just pause the video and think about bank robbery. And I'm hoping that no one's ever experienced firsthand a bank robbery, because it would be terrifying. But I want you just to very quickly, like, just write down all of the words that you would associate with a bank robbery. Like, picture it in your mind. Who can you see? What are they wearing? What are they holding? What are they saying? What's happening? And then, so do that first. And the thing is, your ideas about how a bank robbery should work, your pre-event information, may interfere with your memory if you ever experience a real bank robbery. It will cause proactive interference. So when you look at your description, it's probably got things like guns, balaclavas or masks, shouting, probably men wearing black, people saying get down or give me the money. You're probably thinking about getaway drivers. We've got all of this stereotypical information, and it comes from, hopefully not from real experience, but from things like films, TV shows, documentaries, the news, Crime Watch. You know, we've got this idea of what a bank robbery should be like. So if we were ever in a real bank robbery, God forbid, if we ever were, then if we were then interviewed, then by the police, you know, if they said, oh, what did you see? It's likely that you would have proactive interference, that your ideas of what should have occurred. So, for example, like you might say, oh, there were 3 men. Well, actually, maybe it was 3 women. But in your mind, you know, it's always men that do the bank robberies. That's what we see on TV. You might say that they were carrying guns. Maybe they weren't, but in our minds, you know, we think that that's the weapon of choice. You know, an armed bank robbery, we think it's guns, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was they didn't have weapons, or maybe they had a different weapon. So just bear in mind that proactive interference, your prejudices and stereotypes that we all have about how things should work, may interfere with our recall if we may distort our memories if we ever experience something for real. There's a key study for proactive and retroactive interference. In fact, this one is on retroactive interference, and it also highlights the effects of similarity. So some researchers, you don't need to remember their names, they studied retroactive interference. They wanted to find out whether new information would cause participants to forget or distort memories formed before the new information. And they were interested to see about similarity. Would that cause more interference? So the procedure was participants had to learn a list of 10 words until they could remember them with 100% accuracy. Then they learned a new list. There were 6 groups of participants who had to learn different types of lists. So group 1 had synonyms, words with the same meaning. Group 2, antonyms, words with the opposite meaning. Group 3 had words unrelated to the original ones. Group 4 just had nonsense syllables like B, F, Z. Group 5 had 3-digit numbers. And group 6 was a control group. They had no new list. They just had a rest. So if we were doing this in class, then we would all split into those different groups, and everyone would learn this list of words first, which is quite difficult, until they got 100% accuracy. And then we would have we'd split into groups. One group learned synonyms and antonyms, etc. And then we'd see how good your recall was for the original list. So that's what McGough and McDonald did. The findings were that all participants experienced retroactive interference if they'd had a new list. So the control group did the best because they didn't have any retroactive interference, but their performance depended on the nature of the second list. So it was the people who had the synonyms, like the most similar material, had the worst recall. And so it's showing that interference is strongest when the memories are similar. You could try these research methods questions if you pause the video and answer those research methods questions. If you're my students, I'll send you the PowerPoint, so you'll be able to find the answers in the notes section below. If you're not one of my students, then you can download all of the handouts from a link in the description below. And that's what the bar, so one of the questions was asking you to draw an appropriate graph, and you can see here a bar chart. So make sure if you ever get asked to draw a graph in an exam, it'll probably be for 3 marks, and you get a mark for a title that has the IB and DV. You have a mark for the properly scaled chart. So in this case, a bar chart with the bars not touching, otherwise it's a histogram, and you get a mark for the axes. And what happens in exams is afterwards, loads and loads of people come out the exam saying, oh, I didn't write a title. And loads of people drop a mark on that when actually it's a really simple thing to do. So just get in the habit of thinking graph, 3 marks, title, axes, and the actual chart itself. Okay, so we're going to look at the evaluation, and remember the evaluation, the AO3, are your strengths and limitations of the theory. So our theory is that some forgetting occurs because of interference. That's our theory. And so the evaluation is saying, is that true, or is it not true? Is there evidence for it? Is there evidence against it? Or are there, is it as simple as that? So the first one is a strength, and it's the fact that in the theory, interference theory, has literally had thousands of laboratory experiments showing both proactive and retroactive interference. And so why is that a strength? That's what you need to say. So first of all, what sort of validity are laboratory experiments usually high in? Have a little think about that. And hopefully you've said internal validity, which means is the experiment well controlled and is it well designed? And so when you've got laboratory experiments, they are often very well controlled, very well designed. And if you've got thousands of laboratory experiments all showing exactly the same thing and that are able to be replicated, then that adds validity to the theory, because if everything is finding exactly the same thing, that interference occurs, you're just gaining more and more and more evidence. And if experiments are replicated, that adds to validity, because it's showing that even with slight changes, you still get the same results. So write a paragraph of about 60 words now, like pause it and write the paragraph now, just to explain why laboratory studies are a strength of interference theory. The next evaluation is a limitation. It's saying there are individual differences in the effect of interference. So researchers found interference affects individuals differently. Participants with a greater working memory span were less susceptible to proactive interference. They could recall more words from second and third word lists than participants with low working memory span. A further test found greater working memory span gave people conscious control of processing, which counteracted the effects of proactive interference. So what that really means, it's saying that individual differences in your memory can actually affect interference. If you've got a really good working memory, if you've got a really good working memory span, then you are less susceptible to proactive interference. You can kind of overcome it. Whereas if you haven't, then you're more susceptible to it. And I've put there, write a paragraph to explain it, but you can, for this one, you can literally just copy that word for word, because that explains it succinctly. The next evaluation is a strength of the theory, and I like this evaluation a lot because it sticks in my mind. It's not, I mean, it's awful because it's showing how our prejudices and stereotypes can interfere with our memory. But it's a very, very easy one to remember. So it was done back in 1947. It's a really old study. It's called the Black Man, White Man Razor Study. And what happened was participants were shown a picture of a white man threatening a black man with a razor. So remember, this is 1940s, and I don't think like the weapon of choice these days is a cutthroat razor, but it was probably back then. So look at the picture. This is the picture they were shown. The white man on the left is holding a weapon, that is a razor, and he's threatening the black man. So at the time, racial prejudice was very strong in America. And a week later, when the participants came back to the laboratory, they were just told, oh, can you describe the picture? So what do you think happened? How do you think they remembered it? And you're right in thinking that they remembered it, that it was the black man threatening the white man, because their racial prejudices and stereotypes had distorted the picture in their brain, in their memory, and so they remembered it incorrectly. And it just goes to show how susceptible our memories are to change and to distortion. So this is really good evidence of proactive interference. distorting people's memories because of their racial stereotypes. Again, write a paragraph showing like that strength. We can criticize interference theory for a lack of external validity because we already said there are thousands of laboratory experiments, but in a laboratory, learning is different, and learning and forgetting is different than in the real world. So what type of external validity is lacking? And hopefully you're thinking about like ecological validity, mundane realism. So many of the studies had a really fake task like learning a list of words, but that doesn't really explain forgetting in the real world. Like, why might we always forget somebody's birthday, or why might we forget an appointment when there isn't really any interference? When you're in a laboratory, you tend to be like, you're being studied, you tend to try really hard. Whereas in real life, you might not be interested in what people are telling you, which causes forgetting. You might be distracted, or it just is very different. Like, you're not making as much effort to remember things. So the interference theory is often lacking, like the actual studies are often lacking in external validity. But there is one, like this study is a real life study of interference, which is a good one, and it's about rugby players. So they got rugby players to remember the names of the teams they had played in that season week by week. And for some people, they'd played every single match, and for some people they hadn't, because maybe they'd been injured, or I don't know, gone to their kid's birthday party or whatever. So it didn't matter how many games they'd played that affected their memory, or it didn't matter how long ago. Sorry, it didn't matter how long ago they played. It was how many different teams they had played that caused forgetting. So if they played a team in October and then got an injury and not played again until November, they could remember the name of the team they played in October, even though it had been a month later, because they'd only played that one match. If they played every match since, all of those matches kind of blocked and distorted their memory. They all got muddled up together and they couldn't remember the names of the teams. So this was a really good explanation of interference in real life. Okay, so you could try some exam style questions on interference, and the first one I've given you is an 8-marker. Now in the exam, if you get an 8-mark question, then that means it's usually a 16-marker chopped in half. So when you get an 8-marker with a stimulus, the marks allocation is 3 marks for description, AO1, 2 marks to apply it to the stimulus, and 3 marks for evaluation. So it's a really hard thing to do, actually. You've got to very succinctly describe interference theory first of all, then you apply it to the stimulus, and then you do like probably 2 evaluation points. So the stimulus here is that Chloe's business teacher, Miss Donnelly, got married and became Mrs. Watkins. A few months later, Chloe found she had forgotten what Mrs. Watkins' name used to be before she got married. Whenever she tried to remember her previous surname, she could only remember the name Mrs. Watkins. And it says, outline and discuss interference theory as an explanation of forgetting. Refer to Chloe's experience of forgetting Mrs. Watkins' previous surname. So when you do this question, you can't just dive in and start talking about Chloe's retroactive interference. You need to describe the theory first. Outline means outline interference theory. So you've only got 3 marks, so you can't go into huge detail, but you should describe what interference theory is, that one memory blocks or distorts another, and then I would just briefly describe proactive and retroactive interference for 3 marks. Like that would be enough for 3 marks. Then you apply it to Chloe and explain that she's got retroactive interference, and then you just do 3 marks for evaluation, so choose 2 evaluation mark points, or do 1 in detail, but I would probably go for 2. Stretch and challenge stuff, like if you're aiming for A's, A stars, B's, then you should be like building up your 16-mark essays for each thing that we do. And so there's a question here. It says, discuss the interference theory of forgetting, refer to Jamila's experience in your answer, 16 marks. So it talks about Jamila had gone to see a film about zombies and what she'd forgotten. So this is a 16 mark of the stimulus. So here's the structure for that essay. So it says, first of all, AO1 paragraphs, you've got 6 marks. So say what interference theory is, explain proactive interference, give an example, explain the retroactive and give an example, and then probably very briefly give some details about that key study on the effects of similarity, like very briefly, just like the very brief findings and like procedure and findings. Then apply it to Jamila and Chantel. So it's for 4 marks for your AO2. So you want 2 paragraphs to explain the proactive and retroactive interference they experienced. And you might include some about similarity there as well, because it was all about zombies. And then AO3, you're going to evaluate interference for 6 marks. So that means 3 evaluation points. Make sure you do a different paragraph for each evaluation. And those are the key terms just for you to have a look at if you want. Thanks.